Something came across my Twitter feed this morning. I thought I could probably talk about this. It is something that I find weirdly fascinating and also I know a little bit about it. Historical context. It's funny how many people, I'm not sure I can say understand the concept, but it's more that people tend to, abuse is not the right word. Okay. Reviewing historical media, especially modern day historical media, is that a right term? Media, especially because our idea of cinema, this particular idea of cinema, has evolved drastically over the last 100 years. Our news media in general has changed from newspapers to TV. TV itself isn't a modern day invention in the grand scale of things. The first mechanical TV was developed about 100 years ago. We have to look at the historical context of media as well. That's always important when you think, people bring out old media and then talk about how bad, or let's use the buzzword, problematic it is now. And this is how we go into talking about how media has aged. This is not to give a free pass to misogynistic media or anything like that. But we always have to accept that there's a context to that media. It's no use throwing a modern day analysis on old media and expect it to be better, or at least socially better, because back in the day, those things weren't around. We didn't have the type of progressive nature in regards to race relations, cultural relations, spiritual relations as we do now. Well, it's actually too easy to turn around and say this stuff is offensive now, because it wasn't back then. So where this idea stemmed from for today's vlog is, I said I was looking on Twitter and somebody brought up a Playboy interview with John Wayne, where he basically said some, particularly terrible things in a modern day context. He was talking about how he didn't like queers and he didn't like, but this is like an interview from the 60s from a guy that kind of got brought up in an earlier time period where we didn't have our progressive politics that we do now. The progressive movements of like the 1950s were still relatively in their infancies. Okay, the TLDR is that it's easy to turn around and say, this guy says some terrible things, but that was kind of the norm. It's weird when people forget about these things, is that back then, a major league Hollywood actor coming out in support of pro-gay rights, pro-black rights, pro-women's rights, especially someone who was portrayed as this big macho tough man as John Wayne. Let's not forget his first real name is Marion. You gotta remember, this is the same guy who portrayed Genghis Khan badly and got cancer for it. Kind of poetic, isn't it? Yes, it's easy to lambast someone from half a century ago for making terrible comments. But you gotta remember, that was the norm. Racism didn't retroactively disappear. And this is something that progressives still bring up, is the fact of all because there was a black president didn't mean that the racist went away. There's still systematic racism. There's still all those laws that were put in place to oppress a group of people. They're still there. They might have been modified, but they're still there. Gerrymandering is still a thing. Oh, and there's the results of the laws that have deeply affected minorities. Unless things are done to rectify that, they'll keep going. It's not about remuneration or anything like that. This is literally about changing the rules to make it proper and right. You can't just add an equal rights policy but not get away from the other bullshit that denies people their rights. That's getting way into the bushes on this. So yes, John Wayne said some terrible things that we know are now terrible. Would the modern day media go, how dare John Wayne say these terrible things? Of course freaking not. So the pertinent question at this point is, can we forgive John Wayne for his backward ass views in the backward ass time? It's the question I'm not sure I can answer definitively, but I'll answer it honestly. No, we can't lambast John Wayne for basically expressing the norm back in the day. We can look back and say, wow, that's a terrible thing. But we know historically that the privileged white males were doing that. Do I think we should ban all John Wayne movies? Well, no. The same thing as I talked about in the previous video about how can we appreciate art made by monsters. Unless there are stories that have come out about his abuse of his power, which I'm not aware of. I'm not going to do the research now. But we can still go, well, you look at the Hollywood at the time, and they probably were all, in the modern day context, kind of shit. But movies are still a collaborative art. I'm not a huge fan of John Wayne. I've seen some of his movies, they're all right. I'm not a huge fan. People will probably go batshit crazy with that statement. That's a preference. But what about other contexts? I kind of got into a semi-argument with a friend on Saturday. This is another reason why I want to talk about this. He was saying that Superman the movie doesn't hold up. The original one from 1977, the Richard Donner movie. Now, Richard Donner's Superman is a movie I can watch like once every few years. I could probably watch it on a yearly basis. I love that film. And I will argue that it still stands up. Yes, it's dated in regards to, the 70s aspect of like the modern day Metropolis and stuff like that. The special effects aren't up to date. It's a 40-year-old movie. You can't expect that stuff to hold up. But as an entirety, whole presentation, it's solid. Speaking of special effects, there's special effects they do back then, which you could do today and would look better than some of the CGI bullshit you do now. That movie was kind of revolutionary in many degrees. Like some of the techniques they pioneered for that, you've never even seen them doing since. Like literally the whole reflective material stuff. You could use a lot of these techniques, especially if you got a low budget. You could use some of these techniques and you can make some marvelous stuff. And that's the sad thing, isn't it? We've never had a great Superman movie since then. And Superman 2 was alright, at least the Richard Donner parts. Superman 3, it's kind of bad. That movie hasn't held up. Even as a kid's film, it's not great. The only really good scene that still holds up is the bad Superman. But the Richard Pryor stuff is kind of terrible. Or at least it feels badly placed in. Okay, Superman 3 feels like two movies that have been Frankenstein together, much like Justice League. I honestly think Superman 4 is a better film than Superman 3. At least that has a message. It's still a canon film and it's shonky as hell, but at least it has a solid message compared to 3. Superman Returns, I enjoyed the film. It's not a great film. I still love it. And then the less said about the Schneider ones, the better. So a movie from 40 odd years ago is still one of the definitive celluloid versions of Superman. Now people go, oh, you can't make a Superman movie. You can't make a modern Superman movie. Well, maybe if they actually tried storytelling. But we also have a really great rendition of Superman 20 odd years ago with the animated series. That was a brilliant Superman. The storytelling was marvelous. So people always talk about how you can't make Superman, but it's like, well, you can, just they don't try. So let's go look at this as historical context. Whilst we had superhero representation, like Superman was a huge radio series, it had a TV series, in the 60s you had the big Batman revival. There's never been a major superhero movie until Superman. And it really took, 12 years? Didn't have a huge other impactful superhero movie until Batman, which of course was pretty much predicated on the success of and the diminished returns of the previous Superman movies. But people forget, those special effects were state of the art. So in the context, Superman fittingly was ahead of its time. And as a movie, it still holds up. But it does suffer from those elements that were common in 70s storytelling. It's a much slower paced movie than will get made today. It's actually 3 distinct movies cobbled together to make one. The Kryptonian stuff is filmed and shot vastly different to the Smallville sections, which are shot vastly different to the last part of the movie, the Metropolis sections. This was a deliberate aesthetic developed by Donner and his crew. You don't get much of these outside of an indie art house film. I mean, literally, you don't get a Superman movie where they spend this significant amount of time in Smallville, kind of really showing you who Superman was before he was Superman. I mean, Man of Steel, all that shit spliced throughout the movie, and it's literally the same cinematography, the same murky, freaking grayish slush. You also got to remember, they weren't just digitally adding things in. When the shot went at the gravesite for Jonathan Kent, most of that stuff wasn't even in the shot. They painted that onto a plate and shot it like that. That's how a lot of those effects were being created back then. There was no digital composition. Star Wars was famous for a lot of that stuff. And here is where we go backwards even further. Because I want to talk to you about a movie I I didn't want to watch it for the longest time because it's one of those movies that every film nerd is like, oh, you've got to watch this. It's one of the best movies ever made. And the reason I'm going to talk about this is because this is a movie that is now, people are starting to hate on it for almost the entire wrong reasons. That movie is Citizen Kane. And I know you're probably going, oh, Citizen Kane, no one talks about Citizen Kane. I was one of them. And I'll be honest, I'm so glad I watched that film. I love it. It's not a movie you can really now go into it fresh. Okay, so before we get into that too far ahead, Citizen Kane was released in 1941. And at that time, that movie was way ahead of everything else. Most of the tropes we associate with film were conceived in Citizen Kane. That is why it's important. Spinning newspapers, that was Citizen Kane. Again, the use of painting to expand a scene. Citizen Kane even developed, or at least utilized, a lot of really good editing techniques to tell the story. It's probably painfully slow for some people now because it's a very narratively driven movie. The reason why this movie is important is because you can look at modern day movies and you can see the ancestry of still things that are being used today in Citizen Kane. And this is a movie that was essentially Orson Welles giving a big fuck you to William Randolph Hearst. I'm going to look that up. Yeah, William Randolph Hearst. Who, if you don't know who that is, think of basically the 1940s equivalent of Rupert Murdoch. Not entirely sure how much on the sliding scale of evil compared to Rupert Murdoch he is. But the parallels between Kane and Hearst are undeniable. Hearst tried to get this movie completely scudded. He failed, obviously, because this is what art does incredibly well. This is a movie that basically says, hey, this person's a bit shit. So we've got to kind of point out, we can't say that this person's a bit of a shit because he'll sue us. We can't lie about his life, but we can dramatize it and replace it with different characters. I mean, the character of Kane dies at the end. Hearst was still alive. There's plenty of ways you can get around this. If I decided to make a movie about this bloated purple guy who had all the money and power, and I call him Grump. And Grump goes around telling everyone that he was from the poor working class and that he loves everyone while simultaneously stripping people of their rights, building up his power base and finally ascending to the Prime Minister of Australia, and where he enacts terrible laws which cripples the economy and feeds his rich fat cat friends. And it's completely fictitious, so you can't sue me, even though it may reflect on the life of a person. Understanding Citizen Kane helps us understand a lot of modern cinema. And that's why historical context is important, because there was no movie like this before 1941. And yes, every movie you've ever seen is because of Citizen fucking Kane. And that's where I think historical context is very fascinating. I came into Citizen Kane as one of those people that was like, why do I want to bother watching this? I keep hearing so much bullshit about it. And in fact, it was Movie Sign with the Mads, who just listening to them talk about the movie made me want to watch it. I mean, I even knew the freaking twist ending because that has become such a huge piece of pop culture. And even that, people misunderstand the importance of Rosebud. They just go, oh, it's a stupid sled. No, it's literally Kane realizing that literally almost his entire life has been a kind of shit show. And he would take it all back. He would go back to that time before he got taken away. That's the importance of Rosebud. It's not because it's a stupid sled. It's because he's literally lamenting on his entire life. Oh, by the way, spoilers. So we can still learn a lot from a movie that's, 78 years old? Even if it's just to look at what happened back then. And I think that movie still holds up. It doesn't hold up in the same way I would say as Superman, because it's become such an ingrained part of the pop culture, especially cinematic language. But it's a movie I reckon, if you are interested in movies, you should study it. Watch it and just, wow, I can't believe they did that back then. Even some students today would have difficulty trying to do those shots. And these were done over half a century ago. Would I enjoy it as its own separate piece of media? I'm not sure. It's not really my kind of movie in that context. I can appreciate the genius what went in behind it, but I do think it's a little bit slow for me. And I appreciate slow burn movies. It's a story that is just ticking over. And it's ticking over. It doesn't feel like it's even building up. It feels like it's just a series of backstories coming together to reach the one final part at the end. And it is just literally telling the story of this character. His highs, his lows, his triumphs and his failures. As a narrative, I would say it's probably not that strong. Even modern day biopics tend to fabricate a lot of things. They tend to have a heightened dimension to it because they know just recounting a life is not going to be particularly interesting. I think one of the things I like about Citizen Kane is that it's not trying to be on really any side of the argument. It shows Kane as both a protagonist and as an antagonist, which of course is natural because you're being introduced to the character through other people's narration. You don't actually get to interact with the character himself. You are being told as recollections through other people. And that's actually a really cool way of doing things. So a postmodernistic take is, did we really see the real Kane? One could argue that diegetically, we only see him in his own context in literally the beginning of the film when he dies. Maybe that's subjective because maybe that's what the recollection of people who are there. I'm going a bit too far down this rabbit hole. Understanding the historical context can actually help you understand the time period of when a piece of media is. It can help you understand what people were like at the time. It's all well and good to now talk about how movies are problematic. One of the biggest ones is the no, no, yes. I'm not entirely sure the original creators of that trope were really thinking about rape culture or anything like that. But modern day context is now, this is pretty bad behavior. We should consider the postmodern context as well as the historical context. Nowadays we go, that's probably not the way we want to do things. Or maybe we subvert it and we do the woman chasing the man. And even then, consent is one of those things that people are probably more aware of now than ever before. This is the important takeaway. This doesn't excuse problematic material. We can use it as a tool to say, this was a thing, how do we move on from here? But we can't automatically just go, this movie is terrible because, you know, the hit yes, yes, no aspects of these couples' relationship. Or this is terrible because the 80s would pretty much be erased movie-wise because there's so much kind of bad decision-making in a lot of those movies. So I can't say yes, I can't say we have to get rid of them all. We can still study them and learn from them. And I'll be honest, if you enjoy it, you can still enjoy it. But take into account the historical context as well as the modern or postmodern context. That's all I'm really trying to ask. It's no use just throwing media under the bus because it doesn't conform to your modern day way of thinking. Because literally if we did that, we'd have no history. We have so many terrible things throughout history that people have done and people still do. Look upon these things and learn from them. It's probably the best advice you could ever have. Understand why something was popular or relevant. Understand why people were breaking away from the mold. So if you like this video, please like, comment, share, subscribe, all the usual stuff. There's a bell down there if you want to be notified when I've uploaded things. I've got some more down the shed videos coming out. Hope to see you again soon. Ooh, say hello. Here you go.